The plane lurched violently, a scream ripping through the cabin like a gunshot. Margaret's champagne flute shattered against the armrest, shards embedding in her palm, but she barely flinched, her eyes locked on the woman across the aisle, doubled over in agony, one hand cradling a swollen belly the size of a basketball. "Miss? You okay?" The flight attendant barked, but Margaret was already unbuckling, her heart slamming like it hadn't since the day her own world had cracked open and bled dry. Margaret Hayes had always believed in the poetry of flight, not the sterile hum of engines or the recycled air that tasted like regret, but the fleeting grace of strangers suspended together above the Atlantic, their secrets sealed in pressurized silence. At 35, she was no stranger to first-class perks, the extra legroom for her lanky frame, the linen napkin folded just so, the illusion of control in a life that had long since spun off its axis. She was en route to Barcelona, chasing a freelance gig photographing abandoned modernist villas along the Costa Brava for some glossy New York magazine. It was the kind of assignment that screamed reinvention, sun-bleached ruins mirroring the hollows in her chest since Julia had left her for a man with a trust fund and a vocabulary of apologies. But reinvention felt like a cruel joke when turbulence hit at 35,000 feet, turning her carefully curated calm into chaos. The scream belonged to the woman in 2B, the only other soul in first class who looked like she belonged there by accident rather than design. She was younger than Margaret by a few years, maybe 32, with hair the color of sun-ripe wheat falling in loose waves that she'd pinned back haphazardly. Her face was pale, freckles stark against skin that begged for Mediterranean light, and her eyes, God, those eyes, were the kind of blue that could drown you if you stared too long. She wore a simple chambray shirt stretched taut over her pregnancy, paired with wide-leg pants that did nothing to hide the exhaustion etched into her posture. 8 months, Margaret guessed, from the way she moved like every step was a negotiation with gravity. The flight attendant, a harried woman named Carla with a name tag askew, hovered uselessly. "Ma'am, we're experiencing some rough air. Please remain seated." The pregnant woman, Emery, Margaret would learn later, Emery Quinn, didn't respond. She just gripped the armrests, her knuckles white, breaths coming in shallow gasps that cut through the whine of the engines. Margaret didn't think. She just moved, unclipping her seatbelt with blood-slick fingers from the glass shard she'd yanked out without a wince. She slid into the aisle and knelt beside Emery's seat. "Hey," Margaret said, her voice low and steady, the kind she'd honed directing photo shoots in war zones. "Look at me. Breathe with me, okay? In through the nose, out through the mouth. Like you're blowing out birthday candles for a kid who never shows up to the party." Emery's eyes snapped to hers, wild and watery, but something in Margaret's tone anchored her. She nodded jerkily, mimicking the rhythm. The plane bucked again, but Emery's grip loosened fractionally on the armrest, transferring to Margaret's forearm instead. Fingers cool and trembling but trusting. Carla bustled over with a wet towel and a plastic cup of ginger ale. "Sir, ma'am, I need you back in your seat." "She's not okay," Margaret shot back, no room for argument. "And it's she. Trade seats with me. Put her up front where it's smoother." The attendant blinked, caught off guard by the command wrapped in quiet authority. First class wasn't just about the seats. It was about the unspoken hierarchy, the bubble of privilege that Margaret had bought with her last royalty check. But as another contraction, or was it just the turbulence? Racked Emery's body, making her whimper. Margaret stood. She grabbed her leather tote, the one stuffed with Nikon lenses and half-read paperbacks on grief, and gestured to her own seat in 1A. "Go on," she told Emery, helping her to her feet with a gentleness that surprised even herself. Emery was heavier than she looked, the weight of impending motherhood pulling at her center of gravity, but Margaret steadied her, one arm around her waist like they'd rehearsed this in some alternate life. "I can't," Emery started, but Margaret cut her off with a wry smile. "You can and you will. Trust me, I've given up better things than a window view." It was a lie, of course. The last thing she'd given up was her heart, shattered on the kitchen tiles of a Brooklyn brownstone. But lies had their place in survival. Emery sank into the plush leather of Margaret's seat, sighing as the wider space accommodated her form. Margaret wedged into 2B, the armrest digging into her side, but the proximity to the galley meant she could flag down Carla for ice packs and extra pillows. As the plane leveled out over the darkening ocean, Emery turned her head, those blue eyes searching Margaret's face in the dim cabin light. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice raw like she'd been holding back tears for hours. I don't know. It felt like everything was ending up there. Margaret waved it off, but her pulse hadn't slowed. Rough air's a bitch. What's got you crossing the pond solo? Baby shower in Barcelona. Emery's laugh was small, brittle. More like running from one in Seattle. My ex, well, the donor really decided fatherhood wasn't his vibe after all. Said it was too heteronormative for his new phase. So here I am, 8 months in, chasing family history in Catalonia. My abuela's from a little fishing village up the coast. Figured the salt air might do us good. The words hung between them, laced with the kind of ache Margaret recognized all too well. She nodded, unwrapping a protein bar from her bag and breaking it in half. Eat. Blood sugar's probably tanking. I'm Margaret, by the way. Photographer. Chasing ghosts in Cadaqués shadows. Emery. She took the bar, nibbling tentatively. Graphic designer. Or was, before this little kicker turned my drafting table into a nap pod. They talked then, in the halting way strangers do when altitude strips away pretenses. Emery confessed the loneliness of single motherhood on the horizon. The way her body felt like a borrowed vessel, beautiful and burdensome. Margaret shared fragments of her own unraveling. The queer wedding that never happened. The way Julia's goodbye note had smelled like Chanel No. 5 in finality. It was cathartic, this mid-air confessional, the kind of connection that felt predestined yet fragile. Like a Polaroid developing in the dark. By the time the captain announced descent into Barcelona El Prat, the cabin lights had dimmed, and Emery's hand had found Margaret's across the narrow aisle. Not holding exactly, just resting, fingers brushing in a Morse code of solidarity. You didn't have to do that, Emery murmured as they taxied to the gate. The seat is kind of a big deal. Margaret shrugged, but her cheeks warmed under the scrutiny. Big deals are overrated. Besides, you've got a +1 in there. Makes it 2 against 1. Customs was a blur of stamps and sympathetic glances from officials who eyed Emery's belly like it was contraband. Outside, the Mediterranean night wrapped around them like a shawl, humid, alive with the scent of jasmine and exhaust. Margaret's rental car, a zippy Fiat she'd reserved for weaving mountain roads, waited in the lot. Need a ride? She asked, hefting Emery's duffel without waiting for an answer. My hotel's in the Gothic Quarter. Yours? Emery hesitated, then nodded. Same direction. I'm crashing at a cousin's in Gracia for a week, then up to the coast. The drive into the city was a symphony of horns and laughter spilling from tapas bars, the Sagrada Familia looming like a sandcastle built by gods with too much time. They didn't talk much at first, the radio crooning old Joan Manuel Serrat ballads that Margaret half-translated from high school Spanish. But as they navigated the labyrinthine streets, Emery opened up again. About the IVF roller coaster, the friends who'd ghosted when she went solo, the quiet terror of loving something so completely before it even arrived. Margaret parked in a shadowed alley off Via Layetana, the Fiat's tires crunching over cobblestones. Her hotel, a boutique spot called Casa Fuster with wrought iron balconies and a rooftop pool, glowed invitingly. This is me, she said, killing the engine. You sure you're good from here? Emery unbuckled slowly, wincing as the seatbelt released her belly. Yeah, but dinner. Tomorrow? My treat. As thanks for not letting me puke on international waters. It was an invitation wrapped in vulnerability, and Margaret felt it tug at the scar tissue around her heart. I'd like that. They exchanged numbers under the sodium glow of a street lamp, Emery's thumb lingering a beat too long on Margaret's screen as she typed. Then, with a wave that felt like a promise, Emery melted into the night, her silhouette rounding the corner toward the metro. Alone in her room, Margaret stripped off her travel-worn clothes and stood under a scalding shower, the water washing away the stickiness of the flight but not the imprint of Emery's touch. She thought of Julia then, the way betrayal had tasted like ash, and wondered if this, whatever this was, could be different. Or if she was just chasing shadows again. The next morning dawned crisp, the city awakening with the clamor of market vendors hawking figs and jamon. Margaret's shoot was in the Example, capturing the skeletal remains of a gaudy-inspired folly half-swallowed by vines. But her mind wandered to blue eyes and a laugh like wind chimes, and by noon her phone buzzed with a text. La Paradeta? 7 p.m.? Fresh seafood. No reservations needed. She arrived early, staking out a corner table amid the chaos of the seafood emporium. Sawdust floors, chalkboard menus, the air thick with brine and garlic. Emery showed 10 minutes late, flushed from the walk, her sundress floral and flowing, a light scarf draped over her shoulders against the evening chill. "Sorry," she panted, sliding into the seat. Baby decided kickboxing was on the agenda. Margaret grinned, pushing a glass of sparkling water her way. "Sounds like a future Olympian. What'll it be? Gambas or calamaris?" They ordered piles of it all, prawns grilled with lemon, squid rings crisp as autumn leaves, and the conversation flowed like the cava Margaret snuck sips of when Emery wasn't looking. Emery spoke of her abuela's village, Cadaqués, with its whitewashed houses clinging to cliffs like secrets. "She left during Franco's time," Emery said, spearing a muscle. "Came to America with nothing but a rosary and a recipe for paella that could make you cry. I want this kid to know that fire." Margaret listened, really listened, the way she hadn't in years. She shared stories from her own fractured lineage. A mother who'd died too young from breast cancer. A father who'd buried his grief in bourbon and bad decisions. "Queer kid in rural Ohio," she admitted over shared churros dusted with sugar. "I learned early that love's a gamble. Sometimes you win a jackpot. Sometimes you lose the house." Emery's gaze softened, her foot brushing Margaret's under the table. Not accidental, not probing, just there. "And now? Still gambling?" Margaret's throat tightened. "Haven't placed a bet in a while. Got burned." The walk back to Emery's cousin's apartment was slow, meandering through Placa de Catalunya where street performers juggled fire to the strains of a busker's guitar. At the door, a faded blue portal in a building that whispered of faded glory. Emery turned, her key hovering. This was nice. Really nice. "Yeah," Margaret echoed, hands shoved in her pockets to keep from reaching out. "Get some rest. That kicker's got big plans." Emery leaned in then, impulsive, pressing a kiss to Margaret's cheek. Soft, lingering, scented with salt and possibility. "Good night, Margaret Hayes." The door clicked shut, and Margaret stood there in the pooling light, touching the spot like it might bruise. Over the next week, their worlds intertwined like the filigree on gaudiest lampposts. Margaret's shoots took her to Park Güell at dawn, where mosaic dragons gleamed under dew-kissed skies, but afternoons were for Emery, lazy strolls through the Boqueria market, sampling olives and manchego, Emery's hand occasionally grazing Margaret's as they navigated crowds. Evenings meant hole-in-the-wall vermouth bars, where Emery sipped herbal teas and Margaret nursed cortados, their laughter mingling with the clink of glasses. It was easy, this budding thing between them, too easy perhaps for two women carrying the weight of what is. Emery confessed her fears over gelato one night, the Trevi-like fountain in Montjuic bubbling behind them. What if I'm not enough? For her. Alone. Margaret took her hand then, properly, lacing fingers on the stone bench. "You're a force, Emery Quinn. That baby's lucky. And hey, you've got backup. I'm not going anywhere while you're here." The words felt like a vow, unspoken but heavy. That night, as fireflies danced in the olive groves beyond the city, Emery rested her head on Margaret's shoulder, the curve of her belly pressing warm against Margaret's side. It was innocent, profound, the first stirrings of a love that felt like coming home. But home, Margaret knew, had a way of crumbling when you least expected it. The train to Cadaqués hugged the coast like a lover reluctant to let go, chugging through tunnels bored into rust-red rock, emerging to vistas of turquoise coves fringed with pine. Margaret had rearranged her itinerary, cancelled a shoot in Figueres for this, trading Dolly's melting clocks for the timeless rhythm of waves on shingle. Emery's cousin, a bohemian painter named Sophia with tattoos of mermaids snaking up her arms, had waved them off from the Sant station with a bottle of cava and a knowing wink. "Take care of our girl," she'd said to Margaret, her Spanish accent curling around the words like smoke. Emery, nestled against the window in a seat that barely accommodated her, traced patterns on the fogged glass, swirls that resolved into tiny faces, eyes and smiles emerging from mist. "Granny's stories made this place sound like Eden," she murmured, her breath clouding the view. "White houses, blue sea, fishermen singing to the dawn. I half expected mermaids." Margaret chuckled, her camera resting in her lap like a dormant pet. "Mermaids are overrated. Too much drama with the tales." She snapped a candid then, Emery's profile gilded by slanting light. the vulnerability in her posture captured in pixels that would later haunt Margaret's dreams. The village unfolded like a postcard come alive. Narrow alleys labyrinthine with bougainvillea, laundry flapping from balconies like surrendered flags, the air sharp with iodine and bread baking in wood-fired ovens. Emery's abuela's house, no, her great-grandmother's, passed down through salt-hardened hands, perched on a bluff overlooking Port Liggett, its stucco walls cracked but defiant, terracotta roof tiles gleaming under the relentless sun. Sophia's connections had greased the wheels. A local woman named Rosa, round-cheeked and silver-haired, met them at the door with hugs that smelled of lavender and liniment. Bienvenidas, she beamed, ushering them into a home frozen in sepia tones. Lace curtains yellowed by time, a Madonna icon watching from the mantel, photos of stern-faced ancestors in sepia frames. Emery's eyes welled as Rosa pressed a key into her palm. It's yours now, Mija. For the little one. They spent the afternoon unpacking ghosts. Emery pored over yellowed letters tied with twine, her fingers trembling over faded ink that spoke of Franco's shadow, of crossing the Pyrenees with a toddler on her hip. Margaret documented it all. The way Emery's face lit when she found a locket with a miniature portrait of a girl who could have been her twin, the quiet tears when she touched the cradle carved from olive wood, waiting in the corner like a promise deferred. That evening, as the sun dipped into the sea, painting the bay in strokes of crimson and gold, they walked the pebble beach. Emery kicked off her espadrilles, the stones cool underfoot, and Margaret followed suit, the grit a welcome anchor. Waves lapped at their ankles, foaming white like secrets dissolving. I feel her here, Emery said, hand on her belly, like she's listening to the water, remembering. Margaret nodded, her own hand hovering before settling beside Emery's, not over but near, a constellation of touch. Families aren't just blood. They're echoes. Yours is loud. They stood like that until stars pricked the velvet sky, then retreated to the casa for a meal Rosa had left. Fidua simmered with cuttlefish and saffron, crusty pan bitamaquet on the side. Over wine, Margaret's, Emery's, a mocktail of horchata. The barriers thinned further. Emery spoke of the donor again, not with bitterness but a weary sadness. He was this artist type, all manifestos and midnight oil. Promised the world, then bailed when the stick turned pink. Said it cramped his authenticity. Margaret's jaw tightened, old wounds flaring. Authenticity's a coward's excuse. Real courage is showing up when it's messy. Emery's gaze held hers, searching. And you? That ex-Julia? What was her manifesto? The question landed like a stone in still water. Margaret set down her fork, the ceramic clinking sharply. She wanted the white picket fence without the queer part. Met some venture capitalist at a gallery opening. Said I was too nomadic, too wedded to the lens. Last I heard, they're planning a destination wedding in Tuscany. Ironic, right? Emery reached across the table, her touch a bomb. She was blind. You're a wanderer with roots deeper than she could dig. The air between them hummed, charged with the unspoken. Margaret felt it then, the pull, magnetic and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff into fog. She leaned in, their foreheads touching, breaths mingling. Emery's lips parted, soft and inviting, but Margaret pulled back, heart hammering. We should. Slow. For you. For her. Emery nodded, but her eyes said otherwise, hunger wrapped in tenderness. Slow's good. But not stopping. Sleep came fitful that night, the casa's walls thin as whispers. Margaret lay in the guest room, a narrow bed with linen starched by sea wind, listening to the sea's lullaby and the occasional kick from the room next door. She thought of Julia's betrayal, the way it had hollowed her, and wondered if love was a tide. Rising inevitable, crashing inevitable. Dawn brought exploration. Hikes along Cala where the water was so clear it hurt, picnics of queso fresco and membrillo under parasol pines. Margaret captured Emery in motion, laughing as she balanced on driftwood, her dress billowing like sails, or meditative by a titapool, fingers trailing anemones. You're glowing, Margaret said one afternoon, reviewing shots on her camera's LCD. Not just the bump. All of you. Emery blushed, plucking a wild thyme sprig and tucking it behind Margaret's ear. Flatterer. But keep shooting. This kid's gonna need proof we were young once. Young. It felt like a lifetime ago for Margaret, but here in this sun-soaked idle time bent. They shared sunsets from the bluff, Emery's head on Margaret's lap as Margaret read aloud from a dog-eared Lorca collection Sophia had lent them. Poems of duende, of love that burned like gypsy fire. One evening, as cicadas chorused, Emery turned the pages herself, her voice husky. I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees. She looked up, eyes luminous. That's us, isn't it? Blooming against odds. Margaret's response was a kiss. Not the cheek this time, but full, tentative, tasting of salt and sweetness. Emery sighed into it, her hands framing Margaret's face, thumbs tracing the scar from a long-ago bar fight in Berlin. It deepened, bodies aligning in the gathering dusk, but Emery's wince pulled them apart. A Braxton Hicks, nothing more but reminder enough. Easy, Margaret whispered, pressing lips to Emery's temple. We've got time. Time, however, had other plans. It started with a phone call 3 days in, while Margaret scouted a cove for golden hour light. Her cell buzzed in her pocket, Julia's name flashing like a ghost. She let it go to voicemail, but curiosity gnawed. Later, alone in the Fiat parked on a dirt track, she played it back. Margot, Julia's voice, polished as ever, laced with that faux casual lilt. Heard you're in Spain. Funny we're heading to Tuscany soon, but I miss you. The real you. Call me. Margaret deleted it, hands shaking on the wheel. Betrayal's echo stirring silt. She didn't tell Emery, bearing it like a bad exposure. But secrets have a way of surfacing like foam on the tide. The conflict brewed subtly at first. A letter from Rosa slipped under the door with the morning's bread. Emery read it aloud over coffee, her brow furrowing. Abuela had a sister. Stayed behind during the exodus. Had a daughter, then a granddaughter. She's alive, here in the village. Wants to meet. Excitement lit Emery's face, but Margaret saw the undercurrent. Family, real and reaching, complicating the fragile bubble they'd built. That's huge, she said, forcing brightness. Let's go. The granddaughter, Carmen, was a wiry septuagenarian with eyes like chipped obsidian, living in a fisherman's hut strung with nets and holy metals. She welcomed them with espuma de mar and stories that wove like kelp, tales of smuggling messages during the Civil War, of lovers lost to the sea. But as Carmen's gaze sharpened on Emery's belly, she pulled her aside, murmuring in rapid Catalan that Margaret couldn't parse. Emery emerged pale, forcing a smile. Just family lore. Nothing bad. But that night, as thunder rumbled over the gulf, the storm broke, not from the sky but within. Emery tossed in bed and Margaret, hearing the sobs through the wall, knocked softly. Talk to me. Emery sat up, sheets pooling around her like a surrendered flag, face streaked. Carmen said, the bloodline. It's cursed. Women like us, strong alone, always lose something. Her mother died in childbirth. Abuela's sister, barren after Franco's bombs. And now me solo. It's like history's laughing. Margaret crossed the room in 2 strides, gathering her close. That's superstition, Em. Not fate. But what if? Emery's voice cracked. What if I can't protect her? And you're leaving soon. Back to New York, to your life. This was just a detour. The words stung, laced with truth. Margaret's assignment ended in a week. Her sublet in Brooklyn waited, empty and accusing. I'm not Julia, she said fiercely. I don't run. Emery searched her face, desperate. Prove it. Stay. After the baby's here. Build with me. The ask hung monumental. Margaret's throat closed. I need to think. She fled to the bluff, rain lashing now, mingling with tears she hadn't shed in years. Julia's voicemail replayed in her mind. I miss you. A siren call to safety. But Emery was the risk, the bloom. Dawn found her soaked and resolved, returning to apologies and promises whispered over chamomile. I'm in, Margaret said, sealing it with a kiss that tasted of rain and redemption. But betrayal once sown roots deep. 2 days later, while Emery napped, Margaret's phone lit with a Barcelona number. Sophia, Emery's cousin. Margaret? You need to see this. It was an email forward. Julia's wedding announcement, splashed across some society blog. But worse, the photo. Margaret and Julia, arms linked at a Hamptons fundraiser last summer. Caption. Bridesmaid duties for the queer ex? Margaret Hayes lends her eye to love's next chapter. Sophia's note. Em saw it. Thought you should know. She's spiraling. Margaret's world tilted. How? A mutual friend tagging old flames for clicks. Betrayal by proxy, but it landed like her own knife. She raced back, the Fiat fishtailing on wet roads, heart in her throat. The casa door banged open to silence. Emery gone, a note on the table. Need space. Don't follow. This was beautiful, but I can't risk more ghosts. The storm outside mirrored the one within. Margaret collapsed, the weight of it crushing her past, poisoning her now. Sophia called twice, her voice a lifeline across the gulf. She's at my place in Gracia. Stubborn as her abuela. Says she needs to do this alone. Pause, heavy with implication. You broke her heart before it could heal, Margaret. But hearts. They mend crooked sometimes. Margaret drove back to Barcelona under leaden skies, the Costa Brava receding like a dream deferred. The city, once vibrant, now mocked her. Its lovers entwined on benches, its fountains spilling joy she couldn't touch. She checked into Casa Fuster. The rooftop pool, a lonely mirror reflecting storm clouds. Nights were for scrolling Emery's socials, a masochistic ritual. Ultrasound shares from months ago, now joined by cryptic quotes about solo voyages that twisted like knives. The climax came unbidden. On a Friday when the rain finally broke, sunlight fracturing through the Gothic quarter's spires. Margaret was at a cafe near the cathedral, nursing an enzymata and sketching exposure notes for a shoot she no longer cared about, when her phone erupted, Emery's name urgent. Contractions, Emery gasped when Margaret answered. Voice strained over honking traffic. Real ones. Sophia's at a gallery opening. I can't do this alone. Margaret was moving before the call ended, hailing a cab, her tote banging against her hip like a war drum. Hospital Sant Pau, she barked to the driver, an older man with a mustache like Salvador Dali's. Fast. The ride was eternity compressed. Margaret's mind a whirlwind of what-ifs. What if I'm too late? What if she sends me away? Sant Pau's modernist pavilions rose like a fairy tale palace, all domes and mosaics, but inside it was fluorescent hell. Beeping monitors, the sharp tang of antiseptic, nurses in scrubs fluttering like efficient birds. Emery was in a labor suite, the door ajar, her face contorted in a wave of pain. Sophia wasn't there. Margaret glimpsed her later, apologetic, paint splattered from her emergency. But for now it was just Emery, gripping the bedrails, sweat beading on her brow like dew. I called you, Emery panted as Margaret burst in, dropping her bag and taking the offered hand. Couldn't. Not you. Margaret swallowed hard, brushing damp hair from Emery's forehead. I'm here. Not going anywhere. Labor stretched into a marathon, hours bleeding into one another under the relentless tick of a wall clock. Margaret became anchor, fetching ice chips, timing contractions, whispering encouragements cribbed from every birth story she'd ever overheard. You're a goddamn warrior, she murmured during a peek, Emery's nails drawing blood from her palm. That kid's got your fire. Emery's responses devolved to grunts and pleas, but her grip never wavered. The midwife, a no-nonsense Catalan woman named Marta with hands like a composer's, orchestrated it all. Push now, Respiras, good girl. And then at 3:17 a.m., as the first light of false dawn crept through slatted blinds, a cry pierced the room, fierce, indignant, alive. Una Nina, Marta announced, wrapping the squirming bundle in a towel monogrammed with faded roses. Healthy. 7 pounds even. Emery collapsed back, exhausted radiance blooming on her face as the baby was placed on her chest, skin to slick skin. Tiny fists flailed, a thatch of dark hair matted wet, eyes slitting open to the world, blue like her mother's but flecked with green. Margaret hovered at the bedside, tears blurring her vision. She's perfect, she whispered, awe cracking her voice. What's her name? Emery looked up, eyes locking with Margaret's over the crown of the infant's head. Leora, after Abuela's sister. Light from the sea. They let the moment stretch, a trinity in the hush, until Emery's voice broke it, soft but edged. You came. After everything. Margaret knelt, forehead to the bedrail. I had to. You're not a detourim. You're the horizon. But the air shifted then, the post-birth haze lifting to reveal fault lines. Sophia arrived at shift change, bearing coffee and a glare for Margaret that could curdle milk. You, she said, after cooing over Leora, pulling Margaret into the hall. Em told me. The wedding pic. Julia's ghost. Margaret winced. It wasn't I didn't know. But I should have told you. I'm sorry. Sophia crossed her arms, mermaid ink rippling. Sorry doesn't stitch wounds. She's terrified, Margaret. Of loving and losing. That baby's her everything now. You break her again? I'll bury you in the Pyrenees. The threat landed sobering. Margaret nodded, retreating to the waiting area. A sterile limbo of vending machines and dog-eared magazines. Hours passed. Visiting hours ended and began again. When she was allowed back, Emery was propped up, Leora nursing with tiny gulps, the room scented with talc and newness. We need to talk, Emery said, voice steadier now but weary. About us. About trust. Margaret pulled up a chair, the plastic creaking. I know. The photo, it gutted me too. Julia's my past, a mistake that taught me what I don't want. But you? You're the want. The stay. Emery's eyes shimmered, but she held up a hand. I believe you. But betrayal's a shadow. It follows. And with Leora, I can't risk her seeing love as fragile. The words were a chasm yawning. Margaret felt the pull of it, the urge to bolt, to reclaim solitude as armor. But she thought of the flight, the seat swapped, the hand across the aisle, of cliffs and kisses and cries in the night. Then let's build sturdy, she said, voice raw. Not perfect. Real. Therapy in Barcelona, maybe. Or New York if you come. Weekends in Ohio for my ghosts, summers here for yours. I'll learn to share the load. Diapers, midnight feeds, all of it. Emery searched her face, Leora's latch breaking with a sigh. The baby fussed and Margaret reached instinctively, scooping her up with a competence born of muscle memory from nieces back home. She cradled the warm weight, inhaling that milky scent, and Emery watched, softening. You're good with her, Emery murmured. Already. Practice, Margaret lied, then truth. Hope. The room held its breath. Then Emery extended her arms, drawing Margaret closer, not just to pass the baby, but to lean in, their brows touching again, Leora a bridge between. Slow, Emery whispered. But forward. Weeks unfolded in a tender unfurling. Discharge brought them to Sophia's apartment, a sunlit chaos of canvases and crib assembly. Margaret extended her stay, subletting her Brooklyn place remotely, her lens now turning to domestic diptychs. Emery's profile haloed by morning light, Leora's first smile captured in dappled shade. Conflicts arose, sleepless nights fraying tempers, Margaret's wanderlust clashing with Emery's nesting. But they navigated with the grit of survivors. Apologies over café con leche, laughter in the bath splash wars. Betrayal's shadow lingered, manifesting in small tremors. A flinch when Margaret's phone buzzed late, a hesitation before sharing dreams. But therapy helped, a bilingual counselor and Izample unpacking their packs. Julia's ghost exorcised in tears, the donor's abandonment reframed as his loss. Margaret learned to voice insecurities. I fear I'll drift, leave you anchored, and Emery to claim space. I need you present, not just poetically. By Leora's baptism, a quiet affair in Cadaqués stone church, Rosa officiating with sea-salted water, their love had roots, tentative but tenacious. Margaret stood godmother, her vow whispered fierce. I'll guard her light as you guard mine. The ending wasn't fireworks or fade to white. It was humanistic, textured like the Catalan coast, storms yielding to sun, waves eroding stone to sand. They returned to America together, Emery to a Seattle studio revamped for family, Margaret freelancing from a corner office now nursery. Visits to Spain became ritual, Leora toddling Cadaqués alleys, bilingual babble blending English and Catalan. One evening, years on, as they watched the girl chase fireflies on a Puget Sound beach, Emery slipped her hand into Margaret's. You gave up a seat, she said softly, and gained a world. Margaret squeezed back, scar tissue long since softened, worth every turbulence. In the end, love wasn't the absence of betrayal or conflict, but the choice to rebuild brick by stubborn brick. And in that choice they found their forever, not perfect but profoundly humanly theirs.